standing on the front porch with nothing but 2 worn suitcases at my feet. I felt the weight of 60 years collapse onto my shoulders. The door clicked shut behind me, the lock sliding into place like a final verdict. My own son had turned away, his wife's shadow lingering in the glass as if to make sure I didn't try to come back inside. The October air bit against my skin, but the chill in my chest was far worse. It was astonishing how quickly a life could shrink. One moment I was a mother, a helper, a part of a family. The next, I was luggage left on the steps, as disposable as the cardboard box tucked beneath my arm. I remember staring at those bags, realizing they carried not just clothes, but the remnants of decades my marriage, my motherhood, my entire identity stuffed into zippers and seams. The shame burned hotter than the cold. Neighbors might have seen. Strangers driving by might have wondered why an old woman stood alone, abandoned like unwanted furniture. My heart pounded as I tried not to crumble, not to weep on the very steps where I had once rocked my grandson to sleep. I thought it was the end of me. I thought that moment marked my ruin. What I didn't know was that it would become the spark, the humiliation that fueled a rise no one expected. They believed they had thrown me away, but they had no idea. This was only the beginning. My name is Margaret, though most people simply call me Maggie. I'm a mother, a widow, and for most of my life, I believed those 2 roles defined everything about me. When my husband passed, I thought at least I still had my son, James, the boy I had raised through sleepless nights, scraped knees, and lean years when we barely had enough to eat. I poured my life into him, working 3 jobs to keep him clothed, fed, and dreaming bigger than the circumstances we came from. I was proud when he married, even if his wife, Jessica, always carried a certain edge that made me uneasy. Sharp words hidden behind polite smiles, control disguised as concern. Still, I told myself to be gracious, to give her the benefit of the doubt. After all, family meant compromise, right? When James invited me to stay after my husband's death, I thought it was love. I thought it was loyalty. Instead, it became the stage for my undoing. It was a cold October morning when the truth came crashing down. Jessica said I was set in my ways, that my presence confused the children. My son, the boy I had raised with calloused hands and weary eyes, stood silent beside her. He couldn't even look at me. Within 20 minutes, my life was packed into 2 suitcases and a flimsy cardboard box. Photographs, trinkets, clothes. 60 years of living reduced to what could fit in the back of a taxi. I remember the sound of the rain tapping against the window as I climbed inside that cab. I didn't cry. Not then. My heart was too hollow for tears. But the silence of that ride felt like a funeral. Only this time, it wasn't my husband in the grave, it was the life I thought I still had. When the driver dropped me at the Sunset Motel, the sign flickered with half-dead bulbs. $43 a night bought me a room that smelled of bleach and stale cigarettes. The carpet was worn thin, the bed creaked when I sat, and the window overlooked a parking lot filled with trucks and shadows. That night, I set my suitcases by the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faded curtains. In my purse, I had $847. That was it. My entire safety net. No house, no family, no plan. Just a number that shrank each night as I paid for shelter and prayed no one knocked on my door with trouble in mind. I pressed my palms into my lap to keep them from shaking, and wondered how a woman who had spent her life giving everything could end up so disposable. Loneliness hits differently when it's forced on you. At first, I replayed every detail, searching for where I went wrong. Maybe I should have stayed quieter. Maybe I should have asked for less. Maybe if I'd smiled more, Jessica would have tolerated me. But no matter how many times I turned it over in my head, the answer was the same: they didn't want me. Not because I failed, but because it was easier for them to cast me aside. Nights at that motel blurred together. The hum of the air conditioner, the stale coffee in the lobby, the endless hours of staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever feel like more than a burden again. Rock bottom isn't just about money, it's about identity. I felt invisible, worthless, forgotten. And yet, somewhere in that darkness, a tiny spark refused to go out. I didn't know it then, but that shabby room would become the ground where I planted the first seed of my comeback. The first week in that motel nearly broke me. Each morning I woke with the same dull ache in my chest, the kind that made me wonder if getting out of bed was worth it. But grief has a way of wearing itself thin, and by the second week, something inside me hardened. I couldn't sit in that dim little room forever, watching my savings drain like water through a cracked bucket. I had to do something, anything, to keep from slipping further into the pit. So I walked to the library every morning. It wasn't just the free internet, it was the sense of structure, the quiet hum of people moving through their own lives while I tried to piece mine back together. I scrolled through job listings until my eyes blurred. Applications went out one after another, but my phone stayed silent. Employers wanted someone younger, someone sharper, someone who wouldn't remind them of age and loss. Each rejection stung, not just for the lost opportunity, but for the reminder that the world seemed to believe I had nothing left to give. Still, I kept going. I polished up my resume, pulled on my best secondhand blouse, and sat through interviews that ended with polite smiles and vague promises of being kept on file. It was humiliating, walking out of those offices, clutching my purse like a shield, praying no one could smell my desperation. Then came the day I met Sarah Mitchell, the owner of a small garden center on the edge of town. She was practical, no nonsense, and her office was a mess of receipts and invoices spilling from manila folders. I mentioned my years handling finances for my late husband's contracting business. She hesitated, said the pay wasn't much, $15 an hour, part-time, but in that moment, it might as well have been a miracle. When I held that first paycheck in my hands, $240 neatly printed in black ink, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. Not just financial relief, though that mattered more than I could say. It was dignity. Proof that I could stand on my own 2 feet, however shaky they felt. I walked back to the motel that night with a bag of groceries and a small coffee maker I'd picked up on sale. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. The days still carried loneliness, but now they also carried purpose. I could wake each morning with somewhere to go, something to contribute. The bitterness hadn't left me, not by a long shot, but beneath it, something small began to stir, like the first fragile shoot of green pressing through cold soil. I didn't know it then, but that tiny spark of hope was about to grow into something far bigger than I ever imagined. One afternoon at the garden center, as I sorted through receipts in the back office, I noticed Sarah dragging a cart toward the dumpster. It was loaded with pots of wilted flowers, their petals browned and curling, stems slumped like tired shoulders. She sighed and muttered that they were unsellable, destined for the trash. Something inside me resisted that, I asked if I could take a few home. She shrugged, probably expecting I'd give up once they withered to dust on my windowsill. Back in my tiny apartment above the pizza shop, I lined them up near the window where scraps of winter light fell. The room smelled faintly of tomato sauce and old carpet, but for the first time, it also smelled of damp soil. I searched library books and free articles online, scribbling notes about pruning, watering cycles, and light exposure. Each evening after work, I'd come home and hover over those dead plants, trimming away rot, whispering to myself that maybe they weren't finished yet. Weeks passed. At first, nothing happened. I began to wonder if Jessica had been right all along, that I was clinging to things too stubborn to let go. But then, one February morning, I noticed the faintest sliver of green pushing through the dry soil of a geranium pot. My breath caught. I touched it gently, as if it were fragile glass. Soon, others followed, tiny buds, new shoots, a hint of life I had nearly given up on. My apartment slowly transformed. Every windowsill became a stage for revival. Empty corners filled with pots rescued from the trash heap. The dull little room, once suffocating with silence, now hummed with quiet energy. Even Mrs. Chen downstairs teased that I was running a jungle above her head. She wasn't entirely wrong. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth, the soft green of leaves spilling across every surface. As the plants revived, something inside me shifted too. I realized I had been like them, discarded, dismissed, assumed to be useless. And yet, with care and persistence, I was coming back to life as well. Each time a brittle stem unfurled into something vibrant, I felt a piece of myself awaken. What started as an experiment became a passion, then a quiet obsession. I looked at each plant not as waste, but as possibility. They were proof that life could return when given the chance. And in their slow, stubborn revival, I saw a reflection of my own. I didn't know it yet, but these humble pots of green would grow into something far larger than I ever dreamed. By the spring of my second year at the garden center, the little side project that started in my apartment window had outgrown every inch of space I had. Sarah, the owner, nearly fell over when I brought back the first batch of plants I had nursed through the winter. Their leaves were fuller, greener, more vibrant than when they had first arrived at her store. Customers snapped them up immediately, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in Sarah's eyes: respect. She offered to give me more of the unsellable stock. At first, it was just a handful of pots at a time, but soon she was setting aside entire truckloads for me. Word began to spread through the gardening community. Other centers called, asking if I would take their waste plants as well. My evenings became filled with soil-stained hands, watering cans, and the quiet rhythm of bringing things back to life. My tiny apartment turned into a greenhouse so dense with greenery that I had to step carefully just to make my way to bed. The money wasn't much in the beginning. A few hundred here, a few hundred there, but it was mine, earned with skill and grit. Each deposit into my bank account was more than cash. It was a reminder that I was no one's burden. I was capable. I was valuable. By the end of the second year, I was earning more from reviving plants than from my bookkeeping job. That was when I knew it wasn't just a hobby, it was a business. The landlord wasn't thrilled about water draining through his floors, and customers at the pizza place downstairs had started asking if they could buy plants from the parking lot. I needed more space. That's when I met Eleanor, a sharp, efficient advisor at the Small Business Development Center. She listened as I explained what I did, then leaned forward with eyes bright with recognition. She told me I wasn't just in the business of saving plants, I was in the business of turning waste into profit. That shift in perspective changed everything. With Eleanor's guidance, I learned how to structure a business plan, track expenses, and negotiate contracts. She showed me how to pitch my services to larger retailers, not as a sentimental project, but as a practical solution to reduce losses. The first time I stood in front of a group of skeptical store managers and laid out my process, my voice shook. But when I showed them the numbers plants that would have been trashed, now resold for half price, generating thousands in recovered revenue, they listened, and they signed on. The work was exhausting. My days stretched into 18-hour marathons of hauling pots, trimming stems, and balancing spreadsheets. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered standing on that porch with 2 suitcases at my feet, discarded like I didn't matter. That memory became fuel. I would not be defined by the people who had thrown me away. By the 5th year, I had opened a proper facility, a warehouse filled with light, rows of shelving, and a team of part-time employees who believed in the mission as much as I did. We had contracts with more than a dozen garden centers across 3 states. The year we crossed $2,000 in revenue. I sat in my office late one night, staring at the spreadsheet on my laptop. My hands trembled, not from fatigue, but from pride. $200,000. From wilted stems and cast-off leaves, from something the world had decided was worthless. That night, I locked up the warehouse and stepped outside into the cool evening air. I tilted my head back toward the stars, and for the first time in years, I let myself dream bigger, much bigger. 6 years after being thrown out with nothing but 2 suitcases, I stood in the grand foyer of a mansion most people in my town only ever dreamed about. 12,000 square feet of pristine colonial architecture, 8 acres of manicured grounds, a conservatory that felt like a cathedral of glass and sunlight. The realtor's voice echoed through the halls as she listed features: gourmet kitchen, mahogany library, a master suite larger than my entire first apartment. But I barely heard her. All I could think was, this is mine. Signing the papers felt surreal. A cash offer, approved without hesitation. I had built a business from scratch, turned waste into profit, and earned every dollar that bought those keys. When the deed was placed into my hands, I felt a rush of vindication so sharp it nearly brought me to my knees. The irony was almost too perfect. This estate sat high in Millbrook Heights, the very neighborhood James and Jessica used to drive through on Sunday afternoons, fantasizing about someday. They couldn't afford it. Not then, not now. Yet here I was, the mother they discarded, claiming the dream they had always chased. Every morning, from the master bedroom window, I could look down on the very streets where they lived. It wasn't petty satisfaction, it was poetic justice. Moving in was a strange mixture of joy and humility. My modest furniture looked small against the vast rooms, but I didn't care. I ran my hands along the marble countertops, opened closets that could swallow entire wardrobes, and lingered in the conservatory where the light poured in like grace itself. This wasn't just a house, it was a monument, proof that being thrown away didn't mean being worthless. That first evening, I sat on the back terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over acres of green that now belonged to me. The air was still, the silence profound. I thought of the nights in that motel room, the stale smell of cleaner, the ache of loneliness pressing against my chest. If only that broken woman could have seen this moment. If only she could have known that humiliation would one day bloom into triumph. But success carries echoes, and as proud as I felt, I also sensed something looming. News travels fast in a small town, and real estate transactions of this size make headlines. It was only a matter of time before James and Jessica found out. Only a matter of time before they came knocking, eager to play family again now that wealth was involved. I swirled the wine in my glass, savoring the taste of victory, but bracing myself too, because I knew what was coming. They had discarded me when I was nothing. Now that I was someone, they would return. And when they did, I would be ready. It didn't take long. Barely 24 hours after the sale of my new home hit the local paper. The doorbell rang. The chime echoed through marble halls, and when I glanced at the security monitor, there they were, James, Jessica, and their 2 teenagers standing on my front porch like visitors to a museum. For 6 years, silence had stretched between us. 6 years of birthdays missed, holidays ignored, grandchildren growing into strangers. And yet here they were, suddenly rediscovering their sense of family the moment they realized I was living in luxury. When I opened the door, they wore smiles so rehearsed it almost made me laugh. Jessica's tone was sugary sweet, her words dripping with false warmth. She spoke of regrets, of wanting to rebuild what had been broken. James shifted nervously, his eyes darting past me into the foyer, cataloging every detail of the chandelier, the staircases, the polished floors. Their apologies felt as hollow as the promises they made years ago when they left me standing in the rain with 2 suitcases. But the ones who caught my attention were the children Emma and Tony. Teenagers now, taller, sharper, still innocent enough to believe their parents' version of history. As they glanced around in awe, I saw questions forming in their eyes. When I calmly told them the truth that I had once lived in their home, cared for them as infants, only to be cast aside like garbage, their faces shifted. Shock, hurt, then anger. Emma whispered that she had always wondered why I disappeared, why her grandmother seemed like a ghost in family stories. Tony clenched his fists, glaring at his father. The lies they had been told unraveled in front of them, and for once, James had no excuses left to give. Jessica tried to redirect, her voice sharp now, saying family should stick together, especially in hard times. I felt a strength rise in me, steady and unshakable. I told them plainly, family does not discard you when you're inconvenient. Family does not return only when wealth is involved. I looked directly at James and Jessica, and I drew the boundary I should have drawn years ago. I told them they were not welcome to live under my roof, not welcome to use me as a safety net. Emma and Tony, however, would always have a place in my home. They were innocent in all of this, and I would never deny them love or truth. As James and Jessica stood there, stunned, I felt no guilt, only clarity. For years, I had been silent. Now, my voice carried authority they could not ignore. The door closed behind them, and the house was quiet again. But this silence was different, peaceful, strong, entirely my own. And in that stillness, I realized what mattered most wasn't revenge. It was freedom. When I look back now, it's hard to believe how far I've come from that motel room with $43 a night draining my last savings, to standing in a mansion overlooking the very streets where my son and daughter-in-law once dreamed of living. The journey wasn't easy. It was filled with long nights, aching hands, and moments of doubt so heavy they nearly crushed me. But every setback carried a lesson, and every small victory built the foundation for the life I have today. What I've learned is this: no one else has the right to define your worth. People may throw you away, call you a burden, or treat you like you don't matter. But being discarded doesn't make you worthless. Sometimes it frees you to discover strength you didn't know you had. My revenge was never about anger or payback. It was about building a life so rich in purpose and dignity that those who doubted me can only watch from the sidelines. If you've ever felt invisible or unwanted, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not finished. Your story is still being written. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please like, share, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your own story of resilience.